At the present time, we are most analytical. And looking around us in society, we are likely to be over-influenced by surfaces and fail to recognize that beneath these surfaces, the large, deep stream of human value flows comparatively undisturbed. Just as the individual may be perturbed by some incident that occurs, yet after the passing of this incident returns to his own more normal standard of values. The same is true with the world. And perhaps there is nothing, no subject, that gives us greater insight into the values which man holds to be important and real than the folklore or fairy tale or legend. First of all, these legends and fables, stories, are of great antiquity. They do not relate to the passing moods of times. They come up to us from a depth. Therefore, they give us a means of measuring depth. And this is of constant value and of continuous inspiration to us, because depth is always richer than we are inclined to suspect. As we go through the fairy tale and legend value in literature, we not only find the universality of certain essential plots, so that we can trace the plots of the Brothers Grimm or Hans Christian Andersen back through nearly all of the cultural life of our race. We find that the primitive Egyptian, the ancient Chinese, the old Hindu, all of these peoples enriched their culture with mythological accounts, legends, and folklore. Not only do we therefore find this stream pouring out of antiquity, but we also observe man's instinctive and inevitable reaction to these stories. Actually, man will not preserve, sustain, or remember long that which he cannot associate with his own psychic life. If, therefore, he comes upon some account that is invalid as far as he is concerned, he will neither perpetuate it nor regard it with favor. From these basic points, it appears then that the continual affection that we bestow upon ancient legendary and the continuation that we have made of the essential formulas in modern literature, particularly fiction, these indicate our natural tendency. For example, in modern motion pictures, we know that all things being considered equal, the audience will require a happy ending. It will require some conclusion that is acceptable. And where we have a strong departure from this, we have a dramatic experiment which depends for its survival upon certain other values which we will also mention. But all in all, the simple human formula is still the most successful in theater, in literature, and in motion picture and television. This again brings up the question, how did we gradually move from the familiar happy ending of past ages to the rather dismal realism which we like to feel represents the thinking of today? Perhaps the answer lies in a gradual motion in the last 50 to 100 years away from an essential pattern in the human psychic organism. For thousands of years, man has been subconsciously dependent upon religious inspiration. In emergency, the tremendous structure of the world's religious tradition comes to the assistance of the harassed or disturbed person. And during those long centuries in which our legendary and folklore developed, it developed in an atmosphere of essential devotion. The individual was primarily dependent upon spiritual value for his personal orientation. Spiritual value essentially stated the victory of good over evil, the victory of faith over fear, and that the virtues practiced in daily living must inevitably in the end have their due reward, whether in this world or in a better world beyond. Thus, essentially, through this whole long period of more than 5,000 years of recorded history, man's great refuge was his faith, was his sincere belief in the reality of a universal good, the reality of a benign, paternal, or parental force at the root of life. As the religious life of ancient man was considerably simpler than ours, there was very little creedal confusion. Until the Reformation, there was practically no general creedal confusion in Christendom that affected the life of the average person. There were various schisms within the body of the faith, but these were limited mostly to intellectual classes, minorities. The great body of religion moved serenely in the small town and in the village, where the people built their homes and gathered in the square facing the church. And here their lives were centered, polarized, around a strong concept of a benign world. Also, the average person at that time was not widely traveled, nor did he come in contact with intellectual stress. He lived simply, thought simply, and carried the daily burden of life. Therefore, your fairy tale, your story, your legend of this nature nearly always builds around simple things, average persons, everyday situations, dramatizing to a degree that which was familiar to all, and which each person could intimately associate with his own personal daily experience. There gradually arose against what we might term the romance literature of the medieval world the rise of what we like to think of today as the humanistic literature. Perhaps the most powerful instrument, as from a literary standpoint, to point up man's disillusionment was the Spanish story by Cervantes of Don Quixote de la Mancha. Here we have this old knight living, dreaming, existing in a world of fable, discovering through a series of experiences that his dream world had no existence, that he was really a madman trying to restore a kind of life that had long departed from among us. After the story of Don Quixote, the increasing pressure of material things began to influence man's subconscious life. He began to develop the plot without the happy ending. And to the degree that religion in him was weakened by the pressure of externals, and he was subjected more and more to the pressures of material disillusionments, losing his simple, abiding, internal availability of faith. As this process gradually developed in society, we observed the definite change in the so-called romance story. We see the individual accepting more and more the tragic ending. He could not accept this and would not accept it did he not experience it. The tremendous pressures that developed after the Reformation in Europe, the 100 Years' War, all of these situations, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and finally the drift toward the scientific approach to life, these began to make inroads into the psychological life of the individual. We may say, however, that nearly all of these inroads, as the term suggests, constituted pressures from the outside. The individual, by nature an optimist, by nature addicted to idealism, began to experience more and more the physical frustration of his own ideals. He began to see or realize that he was living in a society which, as it involved greater complexity, began to lose its essential landmarks. Man was no longer able to observe around him the happy ending. He was no longer able to dominate the confusion of his environment. And this, of course, represents our state today, in which the individual becomes more and more of the conviction of his own helplessness, his inability to steer the ship of his own destiny, his increasing recognition, or at least assumption, that he is the victim of the world in which he lives. Thus, a new kind of realism imposes itself upon idealism. Idealism is pushed backward. Man still knows that it is essentially right. Man is still inwardly convinced that the way of good is the good way. Yet he is unable to demonstrate this through experiences in daily conduct. His neighbors are no longer friendly. He can no longer trust his associates. He wants to trust them, but he finds increasing difficulty. And most desperate of all, of course, he finds that he can no longer trust himself. He is no longer able to feel, as he retires for the night with simple prayer, that he has lived a good day, that he has done the things that he should do, that he has made some valid contribution to the happiness or security or well-being of those around him. These consolations, these natural rewards, are less and less obvious to him. Under such conditions, it is inevitable that conflict should arise in his own nature. And under the pressure of this conflict, that he should gradually take the attitude that the fairy story, the legend, and the good fable belong to children who have not as yet experienced the pressure of so-called maturity. Yet at the same time, whenever we dramatize or make a motion picture of some old fairy story, the adult audience is larger than the child audience. We all want to believe it. We all want to see good victorious. We want to see evil discomfited. We want to continue to live by the ancient code of our religion, namely, that in the end, before the power of good, all knees shall bow, and that sometime we shall have a golden age of peace and happiness upon the earth. These are our natural dreams, and these are still the dreams that most normally flow from our own preconscious state, or rise up from the unconscious background or underground of our living. Against this, we are building a strong intellectual pressure. This intellectual pressure of disillusionment essentially belongs to our mental life. It is our mental life that is no longer able to sustain our emotional life. And the average person today is under a heavy conflict between his mind and his instincts, between his thoughts and his impulses, between his reason and his intuition. This inconsistency gradually develops more and more intellectual validity. We are able to see every day proof of the tyranny of circumstances over persons. Yet we are rather reluctant to accept this proof. We question it. We want to doubt it. We want to try, if possible, to continue to hold the child dream, or preserve what the Chinese philosopher Mencius called the child heart. The child heart we have discovered in our daily living to be a tremendous source of strength, whereas this intellectual doubt that rises within us is not a source of strength. It is a source of division. It is a source of weakness. It takes from us the power of personal incentive. It makes us weary, fatigues us, and by disillusionment deprives us of our vitality. We therefore observe that idealism is vital, dynamic, whereas what we term realism is not vital, and it is static. It weakens and does not strengthen. It impoverishes and does not enrich. So we are struggling in ourselves against what appears to be the fact of materialism and the illusion of ideality. Yet man, because actually his various springboards, his motivations do come essentially from inside, refuses to completely give up or completely deny that which inwardly he knows to be necessary and good. Perhaps this is the reason why all great cycles of materialism, as recorded in history, have ended in the restoration of idealism. There is something stronger than the reasoning faculties, and this something is man's intuitive perception of good, his unwillingness to reject a beautiful reality as he knows it inwardly to be for a less beautiful and less inspiring factuality as he sees around him in life. Thus we see the gradual shift. Intellectually, man is prepared to cope with tragedy. Internally, emotionally, he prefers to function on the level of romantic story. As a result, however, of the rise of a powerful intellectualism, which now more or less dominates social motion, we have the so-called philosophy of disillusionment. This philosophy is intellectually sustainable. Yet even as we sustain it, it injures us. Even as we affirm it, we prove ourselves to be impoverished by it. Consequently, it cannot become the dominant reality for us. If, therefore, we look around us in art, in music, and in all the various cultures that we now maintain, and we observe this gradual drifting towards intellectual materialism, we see it with misgiving. We do not joyously go forth to meet it. And each generation, watching the future, becomes a little anxious, a little disturbed by this drift away from value, because upon our idealism is suspended, or from it is suspended, our entire ethical and cultural life. If our idealism should be actually undermined, should be positively disturbed, then nearly everything that is important to us, it will be adversely affected. Considering the materialistic or realistic approach, observing its works, and particularly noting its lack of perspective into the future, we have become anxious lest something of this nature take over, depriving us of much and giving us little, taking much more than it can give, because it has so little to offer above the level of creature comfort, which the individual has long recognized to be insufficient. Thus, the story of our folklore and legendary reveals our firm foundation upon idealism, and that this idealism is still so strong in us as a group, as a collective body, that we still rejoice in this type of literature, select it, perpetuate it, and still regard it as a rich heritage, and continually attempt to use it in the education and unfoldment of the child mind of the generation. The children naturally are inclined to this type of romantic literature, has also been observed, and that it is the conflict between this romantic literature and so-called factuality that has led the modern psychologist to recommend that children no longer be given this material. It is simply because the ideal brings them into such violent conflict with the factual. The psychologist, the educator, the minister, these individuals do not say that these stories are wrong. They do not say that the moral of the fairy tale is bad. They tell us, however, that the effect of an idealistic literature upon the minds of individuals who are not going to live in that kind of a world may prove to be dangerous. Now, why do we not live in the kind of a world in which idealism can have some fair and proper degree of expression? That is a large question. But man is concerned today more with adjusting with circumstances than he is altering the shape of circumstances. Rather than to attempt through a united effort to build something of a more positive nature, he is content to continue this program of compromise with negation. What perhaps neither the psychologist nor the educator realizes is the tremendous availability of idealism if it was cultivated, directed, made available to the average life of the person. If he had any opportunity, any chance, any means, the average person would shift his foundations onto an ideological basis. It is that he is afraid to do so, or has been educated out of the desirability of doing so. Out of the 2.5 billion human beings that now populate this earth, actually it is doubtful if 1% is devoutly materialistic. Many have had materialism forced upon them by systems, and I think a good example of that would be your so-called Iron Curtain countries. Behind the Iron Curtain, we do not have a solid materialism. We have a materialistic indoctrination attempting to force itself upon masses of people. But left to their own devices, even today, 95% of those persons would return to an idealistic way of life. It is not their desire. It is a pressure which individually they have no means of withstanding. Now, on this side of the Iron Curtain, the situation is the same. Instead of having a strong political pressure working upon us, we have a strong psychological economic pressure working upon us. This pressure is forcing us also to attitudes and codes and ways of conduct which do not please us. And a great deal of our psychological disturbance is due to the fact that we are continually required to do things we do not believe. and to live according to standards that are not satisfactory to ourselves. The individual who is no longer able to respect his own conduct has weakened himself tremendously. So on this foundation, the fairy story becomes a tremendous psychological document. And we can break most of these stories down into two general patterns. These patterns represent the anima story, of which Cinderella is one of the most outstanding examples, and the animus story, which perhaps is best exemplified by the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. These two stories represent the psychological polarities of a situation that we all recognize and all face. We know that within the human being there is a psychic integration, and one school of psychological research has termed this psychic integration the anima-animus focus. The anima focus is the psychic feminine focus, the animus the psychic male focus. These two psychic foci within our consciousness are responsible for a very large part of our psychological literature, of which there is nothing more obvious than the fairy story, which becomes almost, if not completely, a dream story. Actually, if a person dreamed the Cinderella story, either as a participant or as an observer, we could psychologically interpret that person almost immediately. We would know exactly the kind of problem that besets him. We know the kind of situation that has arisen in the life of that person. The mere fact that this story is not necessarily an individual account, but is a collective which has arisen in the body of society and which continues to influence very strongly, does not change the interpretation. It merely makes the interpretation collective rather than individual. If the collective had rejected the story, had considered this story no longer of interest, had failed to perpetuate it, had not clothed it in 1,000 versions and preserved it through 5,000 years of history, we might say that it is all incidental. But the folk consciousness of the race is merely a collective, personal, psychic entity. And what it preserves, and what it accepts, and what it rejects, these tell the story of itself, and cannot be denied by any thoughtful, observing person. In these stories, then, we have simplified versions of the age of chivalry. We have again legends derived from the cycle of Charlemagne and Roland. We have the Indian fables. We have the Persian legendary and lore, and the old Chinese accounts as they are preserved to us in the Red Chamber collection and other ancient sources. In Arabia, of course, the Arabian Nights Entertainment conveys the same essential pattern. Now, in almost all fairy stories, it is necessary for one element to appear, an element without which most of the things that seem desirable to us are unobtainable, and that is magic. A fairy story must nearly always involve some form of supernatural agency, a supernatural intervention. It may frequently involve a polarized supernatural agency, one seeking for good and one attempting to advance evil. There is not only the good fairy, but the old witch. There is not only the kindly old teacher, there is the sorcerer. And there is also some way in which magical attributes are frequently imposed upon the hero or the heroine. So the fairy story differs from sober romance in the introduction of a supernatural factor. This supernatural factor usually involves the protection of some person from impending disaster. Or if it is a negative kind of story, it subjects the individual to the tyranny of magic, of the sorcery of some other person. This sorcery must ultimately be counteracted by good sorcery. And as the magician and the sorcerer lock in their eternal struggle, we can go back to the primitive tribes of Africa. We can go back to the most aboriginal peoples of our own hemisphere, or of the South Pacific, or of Middle Asia, and we will find there human life at the mercy of the struggling powers of good and evil. Everywhere the same essential pattern holds. But in the fairy story it is essential that the power of good shall be victorious, that all shall come out well, and the hero or the heroine shall come to the final good which they desire. The struggle of magic is very interesting because it arises from one of our oldest instincts and one of the most flexible energies which we possess within our own consciousness. Paracelsus was quite true when he pointed out that the great agent of magic is imagination. Imagination is available to all of us. Imagination is a magic power within ourselves. It is the power by which we can inwardly transform values, that we can wave a wand of thought, and by so doing, and by the stimulation of the emotional power of imagination, we can create worlds, we can change patterns, and we can fashion a universe according to our heart's desire. All these things can be accomplished internally. So imagination is the ever-available agent of magic. Imagination, it makes possible to us not only this transformation within ourselves, but also, through its extension into society, many forms of progress, growth, the improvement of things. For actually, all growth, all improvement on the level of consciousness, or in the example of conscious beings, depends upon a certain internal imagery by which something desirable is first envisioned and then gradually brought to reality through art and science. So our magic factor is the power of the dream in ourselves. Primitive man knew this, and he also suddenly came to realize that imagination was more than merely a magic of internal frustration or the creation of an internal life. Imagination had something to do with facts. There was something about imagination that could change mice into horses and pumpkins into royal coaches. And that was the problem that primitive man sought to understand. And perhaps he did better with it than we have. He discovered that there is within man also a polarized magician. There is the good magician, who takes upon himself the attributes of the counselor. He is the Merlin. Merlin the magician was a grave and wise old man whose magical powers arose from his virtue, from his traditional age, from his long experience. And this good magician, Merlin, was bound to the court of the kings of Britain, and became the protector of young Arthur, who was, of course, the hero self. So Merlin was one kind of a magician, representing imagination strengthened by the wisdom of the ages, gaining its authority from the deepest and most powerful of our positive ideals. Imagination then grew not merely of itself, but of experience beyond our common experience. And it is said that when reality came into existence as a material or factual thing, when men no longer believed in magic, Merlin went to sleep in a house of glass. Imagination gradually failed in man, and he lost this primitive power to change things, particularly the primitive power to change himself, and by changing himself, change everything else. So we have the magician now as opposed to the scientist. Now, a scientist is a good practical man who does perfectly wonderful things in bottles and on blackboards with very complicated groups of figures. The scientist is the new magician. He has his own kind of imagination. But he is opposed to the Merlin, the conjurer, the strange and mysterious wonder worker of the ancient fairy lore. This modern magician places his entire emphasis upon the power of the world as magic to change man. Merlin, however, believed in man, the magician, changing the world. One, the materialist or the realist, feels that man must become ultimately adjusted to his society. Imagination, however, recommends that man remember that he can always be master of society, and that it can ultimately be changed to meet his requirements. So the magician, possessing this power of imagination, discovers that as he uses it, he is able to make new values appear, that he can make the dead rise, that he can make the sick well, that he can perform many services, and like the good knight-errants of long ago, he can ride forth in his silver armor, rescuing the eternal damsel in distress. This distressed damsel being, of course, his own anima, or his own soul, that is the sufferer from all the confusion of personal life. The power of imagination is not only its fantastic factor, but the fact that perhaps through imagination more than in any other way, man is able to experience truth. The things that man imagines may be more real than the products of his intellectual procedures. If he imagines beauty, he is nearer to the truth than when he rationalizes deformity. When he recognizes the power of good or the power of self over circumstance, he is nearer to the truth than when he recognizes evil and the power of circumstances over him. Yet imagination can become morbid, and under the morbid imagining, all good things can be destroyed. And the evil magician, recognized under such fabulous forms as Klingsor in the legend of Parsifal, thereby becomes the perverter, the misuser of the creative power of imagery. Negative imagination can take a world and make it all bad. Negative imagination can fill us with doubts and surround us with suspicions. Negative imagination can make everything seem to be terrible. And negative imagination can cause us to be continually the victim of evil or of conditions which perhaps have no existence apart from imagination. Yet if held in imagination long enough, will make such deformity in our own character that we will bring upon ourselves the very things that we have previously invented. Thus, negative imagination becomes a power of evil, and is the black magician, the sorcerer, the necromancer, the one who deals with the dead, and whose machinations are found in spells written upon the road or drawn upon the earth at crossroads by an old cemetery. All these things are also psychological. And today we are beginning to recognize that our own lives depend very largely upon the discrimination we use, the energy we apply, and the devout idealism with which we direct our own imaginative powers. The old Hindu classic has a term which covers the thinking rather well, namely that nothing is either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. Therefore, thinking perhaps becomes our magician, our black magician, whereas dreaming and hoping becomes our white magician, the power which is continually striving after good, striving after the realization of that which is beautiful and true. Now, it seems to us, of course, that it would be quite impossible for us to wave a wand and cause a mango tree to grow, or cause a boy to climb up a rope and disappear in the air. Yet whether we know it or not, our own magic is far more powerful and far more immediate and far more frequently applied than in the case of these so-called illusions of conjuring. Actually, our own imagination can take a perfectly good life and wreck it. Our own imagination can take a useful situation and destroy it. Our own imagination can not only destroy our peace of mind, but destroy our sanity. It can take us and twist us into such incongruous and incredible situations that it is relatively impossible for us to extricate ourselves. And yet beneath all of this tangled confusion and disorder, there may be a comparative absence of facts. We all live in a magic world, and the power of this magic depends very largely upon what pressure we are responding to, whether we are accepting the ancient traditional pattern of the beautiful legend, or whether we have become so indoctrinated with realistic literature that we are predisposed to believe that the unhappy ending is inevitably necessary. These things are of believing, not of the fact. And all magic is of believing. And no human being is without beliefs. And the most devout of all believers may be the unbeliever, who has come to a dynamic state of negative acceptances. These things always appear in your folklore. For man discovered long ago that there was another world, a world that is available to him through daydreams, through imagination, and through the devout integration of himself around some principle which, perhaps not obviously demonstrable, is still necessary to his own security. The individual who has lost his dream has lost all. And it is his duty to restore his dream if he wishes to restore a proper, balanced way of life. Here then is another element of our fairy tale. Now, in the case of Cinderella, we do have, of course, another factor that applies and appeals strongly to human nature. There is in each of us a curious sense of loneliness, of isolation. There is a tremendous frustration relating to value. Whether we wish to admit it or not, we all feel like stepchildren of the infinite at some time or other. Perhaps we are not this way continuously, but when problems arise, we nearly always visualize ourselves as victims. Therefore, in our fairy tale, we nearly always visualize our own psychic integration as being under the heavy pressure of a negative or evil force. The individual is quite convinced of many things in this life, and among these things is the belief that he is in some way at a disadvantage, that the work he is doing is not the work that he is suited for, that the estimation of other people about him is not correct. He is misunderstood, he is undervalued, he is overworked, and he is just plain victim. Now this goes for nearly everyone in some level of thinking. Even those who try to hold a strong psychic idealistic imagery believe that they are in some way victims of injustice. Man is the eternal victim. He is always in a position of disadvantage. This goes back to the primitive fact that man is unable to estimate the true relation of the world in which he lives, unable to dominate the vast and violent mental forces around him, always regards himself with a profound streak of inferiority. Even a superiority complex is merely a desperate defense against personal insecurity. So the individual cannot but feel within himself that providence, fate, accident, incident, circumstance, that these things are working against him to produce a common disaster, and that this disaster itself is a word which means evil star, disaster, and simply indicates that he was born at the wrong time and under unfavorable conditions. Out of all of this, we also, of course, realize the human being's inevitable determination not to admit responsibility for these things. He cannot assume completely the burden of self-directive. One of the reasons that he takes this attitude is also subconscious. Namely, the individual does not feel that he should be held responsible for situations which he does not understand, and about which he does not seem to possess the power of direction or control. Under these circumstances, it is evident that his condition remains impossible or comparatively helpless without intervention or without intercession. And here in the fairy story comes the power of the miracle to break the pattern of human expectancy. There is no way in which these problems can be solved on a level. The only way in which they can be solved is by the introduction of some kind of a miraculous or a causal factor. The individual must be saved from this dilemma. He cannot save himself. He is helpless. Like poor little Cinderella, he has nowhere to turn. No one loves him anymore. And he is under the tyranny of a cruel stepmother and her ambitious daughters. She or the soul cannot break this bondage. Something must happen to redeem it, release it, give it opportunity, and to break this pattern. And in a way to prove what the individual affirms, namely, that his own psychic life as Cinderella is a noble life, a pure life, a beautiful life. There's nothing wrong with it. It is the victim of other people. And in order to be released, something has to happen. And the individual does not know how it is going to happen or what is going to happen. And in this emergency, which, like Mark Twain's famous unfinished story, never seems to come to an end, the only power that man has conceived of is divine intercession. Through prayer, through contrition, through patience, through the practice of the virtues, through being continuously good, though continually afflicted, the individual earns or merits a better destiny. And this destiny must come, or else the entire system of idealism involved in the fairy story is a snare and an illusion. There is also this problem that we cannot completely ignore, namely that man's faith in the happy ending must have some ground. If man's belief that things would come out well was never fulfilled, or fulfilled so rarely and so scarcely that it made no pattern in society, your good-ending fairy story could not survive. So we come to another dimension that is frequently overlooked, and that is that the individual who can actually and fairly and honestly affirm that he has lived like the hero or heroine of the fairy story, been good to those that despitefully used him, forgiven his enemies, been patient under adversity, and most of all remained indomitable in hope, certain in faith, and persistent in charity, to that individual some good ending must come. Well, these procedures may be universal, but the good ending is always individual. And the majority of persons who have lived by these codes have found a good ending, and that is why the story lives. Now, this good ending is private, personal. It may never find a place in history. It does not involve great changes in society. But it does mean that this individual has lived a constructive life and died with a good hope. And this preserves or keeps the pattern of the fairy story intact. Exceptions, therefore, when examined, nearly always indicate that the leading character was not as much of a hero or a heroine as the situation required. So the happy ending lives because persons have seen it, have known it, not as vast social motions, but as private conduct leading to the simple and natural admiration of neighbors and associates, strengthening family ties, and gradually bringing this person into a reasonable degree of security. And wherever this security is not present, the factors necessary for the happy ending have not been duly practiced. Now, we may say that such due practice involves other people, and we would love to hope that it does. And in many cases it may. But the happy ending depends primarily upon the power of the good fairy or magic within ourselves. The happy ending is best assured and most directly contrived by the individual continuing to practice the power that is given to him by this fairy spirit within himself that has the power of transforming and transmuting adversity through constructive mental, emotional interpretation. And when we get all these factors together, we find that the person who has kept a happy spirit will have available to them this tremendous, needed, creative imagery. And if it has been lost, it can be regained. And by regaining it, we restore the desired state of affairs. In the anima image, we have, of course, the feminine polarization of man's psychic life. And somewhere in the background of things, we have to realize that the androgyne psychic nature must be reconciled, must be brought together and restored or reunited. One of the points that is made in fairy stories by moderns, who have sometimes even attempted to rewrite them, is that the story ends too soon. The story should not have ended when the princess found her handsome prince. It should have gone on for a few more years to the domestic squabble and the final breakup. Then it would have been factual. We don't like to assume that after this wonderful romantic episode, anything could follow different from our own too frequent experience. Yet in almost every instance, the fairy story ends at this point. Some say that is why it is a fairy story. But again, humanity was not without its recognition of values. Man knew long ago that the course of life does not run smoothly. And had it served any essential purpose in his psychic life, the story would have been continued. But from the level of his purpose, it did not mean anything that it should continue. Because the thing that was being emphasized was not the perpetuation of society. The thing that was being emphasized was the ultimate union of the anima animus, or the polarized soul power of man. And once that is united, there can be no divorce and no unhappy ending. Because all unhappy endings here are due to the disunity of these factors. Once they are brought together, conflict, which is the source of man's difficulty, is removed. If, however, they are allowed to remain polarized, they result in conflict and what we call the conflict of personalities around us and in our relations with others. This conflict is essentially motivated and sustained by the psychic conflict of divided parts within ourselves. As long as these parts are in a condition of conflict, of contrast, and to a certain degree of psychic competition, we will have the same situation in society. And it is the inability of the individual to get together with himself that ultimately makes it impossible for him to get together with anybody else. The psychic life is the problem. And the story need go no further, because there is nothing beyond the final union of the two polarities of the soul. That is, so far as folklore is concerned. For it is always this reunion of divided parts, this bringing into harmonious relation the elements that cause conflict. Now, these elements cannot be harmonized by any energy, by any will, by any purpose that is artificial. They can be divided by pressure, but they cannot be united by pressure. They can be brought into conflict by error, but they cannot be united by error. Therefore, all negative factors divide them. All positive factors unite them. And it is only when, through the natural development of the human consciousness, that these polarizations are reconciled, that the individual can look forward to an internal integration that is adequate and permanent. The whole story, of course, practically all of our folklore, has descended through such media as the Roman fable of Cupid and Psyche, in which the polarities of the soul are indicated, and by which much of our modern psychological thinking is motivated today. So now we have a situation that is universal. We have poor little Cinderella, who is suffering from the tyrannies of an evil stepmother. The stepmother is not essentially evil in any way in which you can literally put your finger on it. She is simply self-centered and concerned with the advantages for her own children. The stepmother then becomes a symbol of many things. Perhaps it is a form of the so-called foster mother, not the true mother, because the true mother is an image. The true mother is a psychic image within the being, and the true mother must be benevolent. Consequently, let us assume now that there is a conflict between the mother image in the human soul and the parent mother on earth. Because the psychic integration of the human being will not permit the complete acceptance of the material mother. The material mother is always a kind of foster parent, because the soul does not actually believe that it has its complete origin in the parent. A very large number of children claim throughout life, and upon psychological conditioning later, reaffirm that they were locked from infancy, that they were never able to get through to parent, although they might have desperately wished to do so. One of the intervals, of course, is age interval. It is impossible for the parent to share any longer the vital problem of the small child. It must look down upon this problem, look back upon it, or reinterpret it in terms of more mature living of its own. This forms no bridge between the parent and the child, and is perhaps one of the reasons why it has been proven that early marriages and early children have a little better chance, because the parent has not yet become so completely removed from its own childhood. In any event, we have either the symbol of the stepmother, or we have the symbol of the child who is unable to get through to the world around it, to its environment, to any other thing but itself. And in psychological interpretation or imagery, the step-parent becomes symbolic of the receptive person that is close to the child, the one who does not understand, the one who does not help or cooperate or appreciate, the one who criticizes unjustly, punishes unfairly, and is not available in emergency or need. Such a person breaks with the mother image. The nagging parent breaks with the mother image, can no longer be regarded or accepted as the mother image, is separated definitely from it by the internal working of consciousness, and becomes a kind of step-parent, becomes a false mother or an unreal mother. And the child, where this lack of closeness develops, prefers to build a mother image within itself by magic. And this mother image then becomes symbolical of the true parent and becomes the measure of the other parent, usually an unfavorable scale of measurement. Where, of course, the parent has been appropriate, has met the need, has been reasonable, and has created confidence between itself and the child, the stepmother image does not arise. The stepmother image does not mean a literal step-parent. It means a parent whose primary concern is not for the child. It means the parent who has the other children, and these other children are other interests, whatever they may be. It means that the parent has a career which keeps it from the child, that the parent has other obligations which keep it from the child. Very seldom, however, does the child react badly if these obligations are necessary, any more than the child reacts badly to merited punishment. When a child knows that it deserves punishment, its psychic nature is not injured by rebuke, if that rebuke is reasonable. It is only when the child honestly and sincerely believes that an injustice has been committed that trouble starts. It's the same way in connection with the step-sisters, who represent parental interests that separate the child from parent. And against these, jealousies arise, and these become symbolical of enemies, of adversities, of adversaries of all kinds. They are whatever it is that will keep the parent from the child. Under some conditions, these stepchildren may also be other children in the family, where the parent has shown unreasonable favoritism against the child who has the highly colored imagination. Seeking for redress, comparing the world with the image. The child says, "This cannot be my parent, because this does not fulfill the parent image which is born with the child and which is part of the child's own internal consciousness." Thus we find Cinderella brought down into a rather mediocre situation of simply being a servant of the stepmother and the stepsisters. A servant now means mediocre association. It means that the child is sacrificed or bound or chained to the purposes of other people. And wherever the psychic integration recognizes, therefore, that it is imposed upon, that it is exploited, that it is sacrificed to other purposes, the identity of family, the unity of the relationship between the child and parent, these things are disrupted. In this emergency, the child does what all children do. Cinderella retires into herself and into an imaginary world. This is her world of magic. And this is the way in which the soul attempts to compensate for the troubles with which it is burdened. Again, the story, as we said, belongs to a period or a level of idealism in society, in a time when retiring into self was not an experience of frustration alone, but an experience of re-identification with divine good. Primitive man, even, after he escaped from the first pressures of fear, began to sense in internalization a valuable procedure, a procedure which gave him internal contact with that which is superior to material things, the mystical union, the identification of the person with the source of its own spiritual strength and life. This would be the attitude which we find in the Cinderella story. We find the psychic entity, in this case the anima, searching for new outlets and finding them through introspection, through the recreation of its own internal sense of values, the building of an inner life. Now, of course, actually, all of the purposes of our outer training are that we shall build an inner life. The reason why the pressures around us become incessant and continually more aggressive is because they are challenging internal resource. The average person not accepting this challenge throws it back upon society and becomes profoundly disturbed. Actually, our entire material existence has as its end and goal the recognition that it is not the end and goal, and that through man's inability to overwhelm the collective material state, he must come to the realization that his growth, his maturity, his peace of mind, these things lie within himself. So the psychic life, recognizing the frustration which can be worldliness in all of its forms and departments, the competition, ambition, greed, and selfishness of everything around it, personified by the step-parent and the daughters. This psychic life, as in the more historical account of St. Francis of Assisi, turns inward to begin the development of an internal world of beauty. This internal world of beauty must lead to the gradual unfoldment of the great romance of the soul. The romance which leads to the hermetic union, or the identification of the parts of the soul in total relationship. To achieve this end, magic has to be brought into the story, because this magic is the magic of internal visualization. Under magic also would come all of your mystical disciplines, all of your meditative practices, all of your Eastern yoga and Vedanta, all of your Western mysticism and your idealistic religious emotion teaching. All of these things would fall under the same general heading. They represent the ladder by which the individual seeks to ascend into total identity with himself. The soul, discovering that it will not be understood in the world, turns to seek the understanding of its own counterpart, seeks to be united with the only thing with which it can ever be actually united. And if the soul's making this journey, it represents the anima, then the end, the goal, must be the animus, or its union with the positive pole of itself. Here we have a statement that is theologically quite obvious, for we find it again, of course, in the Apocalypse of St. John, where the entire fairy story lives again, now on the level of high religious legendary. Here we have the holy city of Jerusalem adorned as a bride, and we find the church representing the spiritual ecclesia, or assembly of man, being raised up into marriage with the Lamb, symbolizing the messianic power of the oversoul. Thus the search for union with the divine part, or the over part of self, the search for the ultimate satisfaction of all need, the end of all incompleteness, lures the soul to the next of its most magical practices. And in this case it is represented by this wonderful palace in which lives the young prince, who is always conveniently unattached. He is never in a position which is going to triangulate anything, which is, of course, always helpful in the fairy story, but must be true in the case of the soul, because actually the soul, anima animus, are soul mates, because not that they are embodied in different persons who must find each other, but upon different levels which must be united in one being. So the prince gives his wonderful ball at the palace, which is, of course, the symbolism of a high dramatic ritual, a romantic ritual, a symbol of all of the ideals which would be represented by the young and frustrated girl Cinderella. By the aid of the magician, the magic of the good fairy, she is able to attend this tremendous festival in the palace of the prince. This part of the legend, like many other elements of it, is derived directly from the high religious mysticism of the troubadours. The young prince and his gay court must be the court of love of the troubadours. It is here that all worldly things are transformed and transmuted into the rich pageantry of the world's highest romance. Here is a world of romantic wonder. Here is a world of unspeakable glory and richness. Yet it is not a material situation at all, any more than was the troubadour's court of love, or the languishing love songs of the Muslim dervishes and druzes and various religious sects. These things represent an allegory. In all cases, the beloved representing that part of the soul which must yet be attained. Now, the imagination of the individual may permit or make possible this temporary elevation of the consciousness to participation in the mystery of the soul drama. This is your ecstasy of religion. This is your mystical experience, carried in a pumpkin coach that has no real existence, limited by time, must be back before the midnight hour or the whole illusion vanishes. This entire situation represents the story of man's internal imagery, leading him to temporary identity or to temporary experience of the presence of this divine state. This is then the extension of consciousness described by the sage and the saint and the seer. The time when he is lifted up for the moment into the glorious mystery of God, or the glorious mystery of happiness, of peace, of love, of faith, of serenity, and of beauty. As a result of the peculiar pact of magic itself, however, imagination cannot accomplish the final end. And we have another interesting simile brought in, and that, of course, is the glass slipper. In departing in haste from this ceremonial experience, Cinderella leaves behind her an identifying object, something that pertains and belongs only to her, and which cannot be made to fit into any other person or being in the world. By this means, by this circumstance, the ultimate discovery of Cinderella by the prince will be achieved. Now here we come again to another phase of the religious fable, which we might always bear in mind. In this type of story, we have two factors working one against the other, or in a certain sense, in sympathy. One is the ascending need of the soul itself, which is represented by Cinderella and her magical experience. But man, according to the ancient wisdom teaching, not only must reach a point of saving himself, but he must also receive, according to the Christian dispensation, a certain saving grace, a certain power. He must not only perform certain actions, but heaven must move to meet him. Therefore, even in the Chinese, there's the saying, when man moves, heaven moves. So that the two polarities work with each other. It is not possible for the princess now, or Cinderella, to advance her own cause beyond a certain point. She has the mystical experience, meets the prince, becomes aware of his existence, and then must leave, going back again to the Latin story of Cupid and Psyche. Now it becomes the prince who can no longer live without the princess. Therefore, we have the positive or animus power of the soul moving into objectivity. We find, therefore, that this union must be achieved as the result of a powerful action on the part of the animus also. So it is now dependent upon the positive pole of the soul to search through the psychic integration and discover the true counterpart of itself in the psycho-emotional field of man. Thus, by using the slipper, which simply becomes like the golden bough of Virgil, the symbol of identification, how to discover or recognize, the positive power of the soul must also go forth to meet the negative, and to discover the mysterious lost princess in the humble situation of Cinderella. It must therefore again emphasize the humility of mysticism, the simple naturalness of the human relationships in life, and that the divine in man is also searching for its own humanity. That the spiritual energy of the animus desires union with the anima once it has discovered its nature. Once it has experienced it, it draws upon itself the powers of the soul. It therefore goes forth as a positive agent seeking its own soul. Thus we have in man now a double personality problem. We have man instinctively, as Cinderella, dreaming of release, not daring to hope for what was going to happen, but by magic being brought into this magnificent circumstance. Then we have the positive polarity of the soul as consciousness, now rededicated to the conscious discovery and final union of itself with its own psychic polarity. Thus we have the two great purposes which dominate life. First, the ascent of man as a personality toward principle, and secondly, the descent of eternal principle within man toward union with objectivity, thus occurring in the actual creation of the total soul, which is the union of ascending experience with descending illumination. The final union, therefore, takes place when the mortal being rising up provides means for the release or expression of the divine being through itself, and these meeting in a middle distance result in the hermetic marriage or the final union of the soul as psychic integration. Thus, in the middle ground between spirit and matter, between Cinderella and the prince, the mysterious psychic union takes place, which proves or provides the ground for the forever after, living in peace and happiness. The forever after is almost identical then with the concept of the nirvana of India or the heaven state of Western man. It is the foreverness resulting from the final binding of all separate things, the final union of the psychic poles in man, the ascent of the mortal and the descent of the immortal into common union as psychic life. And to the Egyptian, the soul was the immortal mortal and the mortal immortal. It was the being between heaven and earth, the Greek hero. And the attainment of this level above that of ordinary mortality, that was the essential search of the golden age of Greek learning. It was also the end of alchemy, the marriage of the sun and moon, the ultimate union of the internal resources of man, the descending divine power of wisdom and the ascending human power of experience meeting as understanding, or meeting as total sufficiency. That this legend should exist and should travel through countless peoples is therefore obviously archetypal. Man will accept it as no less. In his insecurity, he is searching for security, and postulates it always in a being that is secure, the Overself. His search, therefore, is for the Oversoul of Emerson, the total psychic sufficiency. This is nearly always a prince, or a king, or a ruler, or someone superbly wise, because it must always be the king of the self. It always represents the unquestioned authority of consciousness over all of its attributes and all of the conditions which it engenders. It is a ruler, because it is the only fit ruler of the self. It is always the administrator, and it is always as animus, wonderful, handsome, strong, the fulfillment of all desire, even as when it is anima, it is always the beautiful maiden who must be rescued. So our stories always relate either to the positive pole of consciousness rescuing the lesser, or the negative pole of consciousness through the virtue of its own patience, through its dedication, through its understanding, through the victory of faith over fear, gradually deserving the intercession of the spiritual power. The anima must deserve. The animus must be deserved, because it represents causal consciousness which must be earned, and that which earns it must fulfill its way The psychic nature, represented by Cinderella, must live the doctrine in order to know it. But that which lives the doctrine invokes it, and the psychic prince comes to the rescue of the individual who has kept its rules and obeyed its laws and deserved its presence. Thus the romance of the two parts of the soul becomes the only romance in which the human being as idealist can detect no flaw, can perceive no limitation, and cannot view with misgiving of any kind. It is that romance of which all material relations are symbolical. For it is through physical and human associations, rightly understood and rightly lived, that man becomes capable of these overtones of emotion and consciousness by which he can mature his own soul. Therefore, all physical relationships are symbolical of the divine relationships of the two parts of man's soul, with the attendant members of the caste, all of the other factors, the mind, the ambition, the intuition, all these personified, become the persons in the great psychic drama within man. But this drama is always a love story, for it always represents ultimately man's love for God and good, and his ultimate resolution to attain union with the divine. Thus it becomes a great story in which man's fear of God, or his respect for God, gradually changes into his unqualified love of God, and his resolve and determination to be worthy to be loved by God. These form the instinctive patterns of primitive people, and they have come down to us in the fairy tale and the legend, and their utility and their practical insight is as great today as it was long, long ago. And time is up, so that's it.